Thank you so much for bad pennies have a habit of turning up again and again. So my apologies for appearing a second time today. And this time is a paper on with my former doctoral student, Nicholas Carline, who at the University of Birmingham, and my colleague at the University of Oklahoma, Scott Lynn. And this is about extreme actions by incumbent CEOs to frustrate takeover bids. So we all know that the threat of takeover bids represents an important external control mechanism for the corporate world, and serves to motivate managers to operate more efficiently. And when we talk of efficiencies, these inefficiencies can arise from either agency problems or simply incompetence. Now, successful bids serve to reallocate these corporate resources to their highest value use and provide a means for disciplining, if you like, incompetent managers. Now, in this context, the United States has an extensive anti-takeover code, which essentially takes a lot of ex-ante steps to defeat takeovers. Now, these are things like poison pills, anti-takeover amendments, staggered boards. And there is one line of research which is looking into the efficacy of these measures. Now, all of these are ex-ante resistance measures designed to create some frictions in the takeover market to deter bids or prevent them from succeeding. But what we are talking about in this paper is something different. So we are trying to move away into an environment, corporate environment, where we don't have any US-style shock repellents. And where we do not have the kind of enormous frictions that characterize the US takeover market. So this is an empirical study of extreme takeover resistance after a bid has taken place. So this is different in as much as we're talking about ex-post resistance, resistance after the event. We are talking also from a very corporate governance perspective. There's a lot of research which is anchored in abnormal returns. Our favorite pastime is to look at event studies. So this one is really grounded in corporate governance characteristics of the target management and the CEO. And we are really studying targets which take extreme actions to somehow frustrate takeover bids. So takeover resistance is something which is very common. So some of the major cases which have taken place, for example, the ArcelorMittal Steel $27 billion hostile takeover in 2006. The Yahoo Microsoft was also a hostile affair. Cadbury Kraft was a hostile affair. More recently, the AstraZeneca Pfizer bid in the United Kingdom. So there are of course a lot of actual takeover resistance. Now, there are relatively few studies which have empirically examined the nature of takeover resistance. So as I said, most of the takeover resistance stuff is really in terms of abnormal returns, but they don't really characterize the type of takeover resistance horizontally. And a notable exception is among the very earliest papers by Dan and D'Angelo in JFE 1988, which focused on abnormal returns around frustrating actions to thwart takeovers. Now, this focus of this paper is on the corporate governance features, the target and resisted bids. And what we are looking at is, first, resisted versus unresisted bids as a kind of a general control. And number two, bids with frustrating actions versus other resisted bids. So if you look at a takeover resistance process, you have a bidder who decides to bid. Or maybe if he decides to bid, he negotiates. He can either go and have a friendly offer, or he can fail in a friendly offer, and then he can make an offer which is resisted. And if there is a resisted offer, the target can take what we call a frustrating action, which is an action which is somehow designed to frustrate the takeover, or less extreme target resistance methods. So what's the frustrating action? Frustrating action is the triggering by an incumbent CEO or target management, I don't know why we've focused on CEOs, of any operational financial transaction that makes targets very difficult or significantly more difficult to acquire at least for the first initial would-be acquirers. So there are a lot of examples which we can have of frustrating actions. So for example, spin-offs and sell-offs, which are divestments that deny bidders access to assets of value. Now, a concrete example in the United Kingdom, Six Continents announced that it was pursuing a spin-off of its hotels and soft drinks businesses from its retail side, and the divestment was intended to deny the bidder cap management investment access to assets of value from the cash flow or a breakup perspective. Now, the abnormal return of that announcement was minus 12%. Example number 2, merger and acquisitions and joint ventures, which make target firms much more cumbersome to acquire due to size, strategic reasons, or antitrust grounds, or which eliminates bidders entirely. So for example, from the UK again, Burnfleet announced that it was pursuing the acquisition of Link Dynamic Systems to be financed by a rights issue. The amalgamation was intended to make it cumbersome for Ferry Group to acquire Burnfleet. Possible, but very cumbersome. Again, an abnormal return of minus 12%. Stock repurchase is special dividends, which involve payouts that effectively eliminate the bidder's plans for the utilization of excess cash, which is held by the target. And in the case of the targeted, for example, targeted repurchases, that increase the proportion of stock in the hands of friendly stockholders as well. Example again, British Polythene Industries announced that it was pursuing a tender offer to buy back 30% of its issued shares after the bid. The payout was intended to nullify the plans of McFarlane Group, the bidder, for the efficient utilization of BPI's excess cash. Again, abnormal return minus 4%. Example 4, going private transactions, which used competing management buyouts to create potentially costly bidding contests. Now, in some sense, that's also good for the shareholders. So Worldwide Group announced that it was pursuing a leveraged buyout for all or part of its company. Now, this buyout was intended to create a costly bidding context for Boots in the United Kingdom and to give WWG a private control to prevent further unwanted takeover attempts. Again, abnormal return minus 2.5%. 5, management changes which make removal of newly appointed officers especially costly because of special contractual arrangements like golden parachutes triggered by a takeover. So, for example, Blockley announced that it was pursuing the appointment of a new chairman, resulting in the separation of this role from that of the chief executive. And this board change was intended to make a removal of the newly appointed director especially costly because of the special contractual payments triggered by a successful takeover. So, once again, very explicitly designed to thwart the takeover, minus 1.5%. White squires, it's in this field jargon, which essentially involves solicitation of a friendly third-party participant to acquire a stake that will effectively block the takeover. So Owners Abroad Group, for example, announced that as part of a strategic alliance, it was pursuing 12.6% placement of new shares with Thomas Cook. This placement was intended to thwart Air Tour's takeover attempt by soliciting the friendly third party to acquire a strategic-only blocking sale. Abnormal return minus 3%. Now, all of these are not necessarily bad. On the other side, give you an example of peaceful resistance. I don't think I used the word peaceful resistance in the paper, but I'm using it here. So Tilbury Group responded to a takeover bid from Lilly by forecasting significantly increased profits and dividends. So we're going to say, oh, hey, your bid is too low, you must increase it. Wellcome responded to a takeover bid from Glaxo by actively soliciting a third-party bidder. For example, Allied Colloids Group responded to a takeover bid from Hercules by both forecasting increased profits from dividends and also by actively soliciting a third-party bidder. All of these are examples of what you can call peaceful resistance. So frustrating actions, when announced, can clearly be value-reducing for target shareholders. And however, it's not a black and white story. And both theoretically and largely theoretically and empirically as well, predict that frustrating actions can also benefit target shareholders. So although value-reducing for the initial would-be acquirers, they do not always make targets less valuable for the subsequent or other would-be acquirers. Now, at the same time, the threat to trigger frustrating action can also generate higher offer premiums from the initial would-be acquirer itself. When we come to any kind of resistance, both frustrating and peaceful, we need to keep in mind that these can be motivated by the desire to generate price improvement from initial offers, or it can be triggered by the desire of the incumbent management to entrench itself. So in this paper, we examine the relative importance of initial offer and target characteristic for predicting these frustrating actions in hostile takeover bids to shed light on the motivational implications for this type of resistance. So the paper is all about motivational implications. And second, examine whether the motivational implications for frustrating actions are reflected in the target stockholder wealth effects, i.e. lower wealth effects, of hostile takeover bids, and in the rate of what happens to CEOs, rate of incumbent CEO turnover after hostile takeover bids. And fortunately, the market seems to work well in both these cases. Our sample of target companies is from the UK, and we have about 120 cases of resistance and a large number of unresisted cases. There were 121 cases which were formally resisted by the target. All the others were friendly offers, and we examined each and every one of these, and to determine if the resistance are motivated by the desire to get more for shareholders or by the desire to destructively thwart the bid in whatever way that was feasible. So let me skip. So in terms of the kind of sample that we had, once again, we could sort of divide this into sort of 6 kinds of frustrating actions. And this table gives you a sort of a brief overview of the distribution of these frustrating actions. There could be multiple frustrating actions in a single case. So 1 used 3, 41 used 1, 8 used 2, and 1 used 3. So that is the kind of picture that one has. We also, there is so much of empirical work here. I cannot go into all the controls, the identification strategies, and so on and so forth. Suffice it to say that we account for the effects of censoring other takeover bids. That is something which we got when we presented the paper at the American Finance Association meetings as being a very important thing to do. So we did that, take a lot of time. And we also, for all of those kinds of tests for proper identification strategies and econometric excellence, we've tried to incorporate in the paper. And we differentiate particularly between target fiscal year ends before and after the Cadbury report, which was very governance focused, which made it mandatory for incumbent boards to state the extent they comply with the recommendations intended to lessen CEO control. And of course, we find results which are completely consistent with that, which was nice. So in terms of research questions and findings, the question, is the choice to engage in frustrating actions influenced by target firm ownership and governance? The answer is yes. I'm almost there, for once. Is stockholder wealth influenced by frustrating actions? Yes, and negatively. Is the probability of takeover success influenced by the frustrating actions? Yes, in the absence of a third-party bid. Are CEOs who engage in frustrating actions negatively impacted in the ex-post employment market? Yes. So I would characterize the findings as follows. First, frustrating actions are motivated less by the potential for price improvement from initial offers than other types of bid resistance. They are also motivated more by incumbent CEO inefficiency and control, and hence the potential for entrenchment rather than other types of bid resistance. And the relationship between initial offer and target characteristics and the probability of general hostility in the initial response has much more clearer motivational connections when it comes to frustrating actions than is the case with other types of resistance, like other types of peaceful resistance. So it's kind of very clear that the frustrating actions are much more entrenchment oriented. The motivational implications of frustrating actions are reflected in smaller target stockholder wealth effects of hostile takeover bids and a higher rate of incumbent CEO turnover after hostile takeover bids than for other types of resistance. And investors, successful acquirers, and successful incumbent boards seem to come to the conclusion that incumbent CEOs are more likely to have triggered the actions, the frustrating actions as a ploy for their own ends rather than for the advantage of target shareholders. Why? Hostile takeover bids with frustrating actions are associated, I didn't mean to say why with middle-aged, but still, that why was not right. Hostile takeover bids with frustrating actions are associated with more middle-aged incumbent CEO and with larger incumbent CEO stock holdings, but smaller other incumbent director shareholdings than other hostile takeover bids. Hostile takeover bids with frustrating actions are also associated less with independent incumbent chairpersons and with smaller target outside block holdings and other hostile takeover bids. And all in all, the picture we get, we're almost there. All in all, the findings, our findings for incumbent CEO control indicate that frustrating actions is motivated more by the potential for entrenchment than for other types of bid resistance. I know I'm sitting in a room which also includes Brian, so I have to be careful in saying what I am about to say. But our findings add to the ongoing debate about the legitimacy of hostility in takeover bids by suggesting that there could be consideration of limitations on the ability of incumbent CEOs to trigger frustrating actions in response to takeover bids, rather than a free-for-all market. Thank you. Not too much beyond time, right?
Okay, good afternoon. And let me just say, when I read this paper with great interest, normally when finance people would probably place it like this is a finance paper on mergers and acquisitions and how firm value responds. We can look at it also as a governance paper because it deals with the market for corporate control, and we know that market for corporate control is one of the most important external mechanisms that are used to discipline firms. So I look at the paper in this light. Now here what happens, like when there is a takeover bid, normally from a governance angle, takeover bid should occur only for firms which are inefficient in some way, and therefore when the takeover happens or offer is made, either the firms will respond and correct themselves, or they will not correct themselves and will be taken over, and then the firm will perform in the way that it's supposed to perform. So therefore takeovers has this corporate governance angle. Now the issue is this, that whenever a governance takeover bid happens, then managers could be entrenched. So therefore they take actions not in the benefit of the shareholders, which is supposed to be the objective of market for corporate control, but to entrench themselves and do their private benefits. So they benefit, but the shareholders as such do not benefit from this action. And this paper is trying to look at this particular issue, though its focus is a little bit different. So let me look up the empirical setup of the paper. This is a subtraction mistake, this is 662. So in this paper, that the version that I am discussing, there are in the sample 792 takeover bids, of which 130 are hostiles, and by construction 662 are non-hostile. These are the friendly offers. Within this 132, so what is a hostile offer? A refusal of initial offer. That means there's an offer was made, and then you said something that I don't accept your offer. And then, so if you said that, if you did not accept that initial offer, this is called a hostile. If you did not do anything, then this is non-hostile offers. And in the hostile offers, of course, there's a lot of literature between hostile and non-hostile offers. Here the beauty of the paper is looking at the hostile and making a subdivision of this hostile paper, saying you take some action, because if you do not accept your offer, then I have to take an action. And these actions can be extreme actions, or it can be other than extreme actions. So it's just the complement set. Extreme actions are classified by some way in the paper. Probably there is an RNS classification. Somewhere it is written that this is the classification which makes acquiring of the target difficult, as well as reduces the value of the target. This is probably the RNS classification. So you go by some already existing coding, which picks out the extreme actions. And of course, those who are not extreme actions are other actions. And then you compare the performance of this set versus this set, and this is what you find, that stockholder wealth actually decreases in this extreme action. So that's a bad news in some sense, that you take an action which is good for you. Presumably that's why you took the action, but it does not lead to shareholder wealth. It falls. However, the good news is the CEO turnover increases, that post this action, you are fired from the board, so therefore there is always a compensating effect of firing a manager who took an inoptimal decision. And of course, results vary on whether the takeover was successful or not, because there is some interaction terms in the model. So this is generally the overview of the paper. So I have just two slides. One is methodological and other is empirical. First is the definition of extreme or frustrating actions, actions that make targets less valuable and more difficult to acquire. This is what I found in the paper. So as Pradeep has said, so this classification is very important because this sets up the control group and the target group in some sense. So one issue is that whether short-run and long-run effects of extreme actions are taken into account, because we know that certain actions which appear as extreme and which appears to decline, lead to decline in the short-run value of the firm may be different than the long-run value. So whether this RNS classification takes into account this distinction of short-run decline versus long-run decline. This is something which probably the definition already takes into account, I don't know, but this is a nice thing to explain because that sets up the control group. Now, does this definition presupposes the outcome? Because I saw in the outcome, it's written the RNS classification says that it makes target acquisition difficult and reduces its value. If this is indeed the classification, then it's no wonder that if I do a regression at the end on the outcome, it will find that because it has been defined to be like that. So this is something has to be checked. Motivation, of course, is still there because even if it reduces the value, what is the thing that motivated it is an important question. Second issue is other actions, the complement of extreme actions, because the other actions are those which are not extreme actions. So now, what are the objective of these actions? Because those are also classified under hostile. So they must be doing something. They must be reducing the probability of takeover in the beginning so that to get a higher value later. Now, in paper, these extreme actions or non-extreme actions are rather a little bit muted. It's like call the shareholders, set them a sort of a communication and delay it. So these appear, that's okay, 2 minutes fine. This appears, though it is within the branch of hostile actions, it appears the action that taken appear to be non-hostile in some sense. So my point is, here we are discussing about this versus this. Should we discuss this versus this or this versus this whole two things taken together? Because it is possible that when you compare this with this, because these are both are hostile takeovers, so this may be faring worse than this, but as a group, they may be still faring better than the non-hostile. So which is the reference group is an important thing that we have to think about it. So that's why I made a comment, can we compare extreme actions in, the other point which is said in the paper that the UK and the US are different, because in the US, certain hostility is already built in the statute, which is not there in the UK laws, because poison pill, shark repellents are there. So it will be nice to compare the hostile, or in some sense, extreme value action in US versus the UK, because I would guess the extreme actions in the US would be much sharper, because that comes over and above the shark repellents that are already in the statute, which is not true in the UK. So that will be a nice thing to think about. I will not, I will want to say the last point, which is should the dummy variable be one for successful extreme action? That is, those that were actually frustrated the potential one. That means this is right now, action was taken, whether it was finally resulted in the action being successful or not, that should be the dummy variable or not the one that you think. In observations on empirical, maybe these are the two most important points. Should both the equation be estimated together? Because you are taking an action and that is causing some outcome. These are simultaneous decisions or simultaneous outcomes. Should we estimate the both equations together? If you are going to estimate in 2 steps, then of course, then one should have the estimated probability of frustrating actions in the second regression rather than the variable itself, because they are both simultaneously determined, and this 2-step is a sort of 2SLS or 2-stage least square. That's the empirical one. Others are simpler things which you can read. Thank you very much. I enjoyed reading the paper, and my last slide is here. Enjoyed reading the paper, and I hope it's
I'm tempted to say no questions from the floor and go directly to the next one, but I think I'm going to open up for the standard 5 minutes if there are questions from the floor.
Thanks very much, Roberto, for your comments, and I would be they are very useful, and we'll certainly take them on board. Let me take a minute to respond on the RNS classification. So this was an issue. How do we identify extreme events? How do we identify events which are frustrating actions? Now, the concept of frustrating actions was, to some extent, triggered by Section 21 of the UK Takeover Code. So the UK Takeover Code explicitly recognizes that the incumbent management can take frustrating action, and therefore defines frustrating action and does things to limit those frustrating actions. So all the frustrating actions have to be formally approved by a member, by the shareholders. So all of these are cases which have been all duly approved by the shareholders. Now, And in that frustrating action, they specifically define it, and we use the same definition. For some reason, in the latest draft, it's not the draft which you had. It's not there, and I don't know why my co-author omitted it from the last draft. I think it's essential for it to be there, to be motivated from there. And incidentally, these classifications are exactly identical. It's almost as if the person who drafted the UK takeover law had some finance input from the D'Angelo paper, because the examples correspond identically to the examples from the D'Angelo paper. So they kind of fit in very well, and those are the ones which we have used. Our discussant at the American Financiation meetings felt that we should also add the definition of negative to the abnormal return in the sample. I don't agree with that. I think we'll probably go back to the original one. The difference is only we had 52 cases which would have been otherwise identified, and now we have 50. So this is only 2 cases. So it's not a big deal. I think we should just go with one or the other. It will not make much difference. Your comment about the reference group to include friendly takeovers it's certainly a possibility. Your comment on comparing US and UK, which involved a huge amount of work, but we'll, probably a different paper. In relation to the issue about simultaneous estimation, that's very well taken. We'll certainly take a closer look at that. And in relation to the comment on India, I am really not aware of what the position in India is on thwarting takeover bids. If there is, I don't think there are poison pill type of defenses. There are no ex ante defenses. You would be the much better person to respond to that, Subrata.
I think we get data, I mean, as far as the papers that in India I have seen, it's mostly dummy variable taken over or not, or maybe hostile, but whether we will get the exactly like what are the actions you are allowed to take, or which actions are, I mean, there is probably no restrictions on the actions that you take, but here there is a classification of the actions that are considered to be in the interest of the CEO and therefore classified as extreme, and that therefore they has to be voted by the shareholders to guard against that. I don't think we get that one.
Haven't there been a lot more of these takeover bids in India? Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, I'm just asking because I don't watch this literature, but it seems like...
My understanding is that India has a very, very dominant takeover market for corporate control. We have the mandatory bid rule just like the UK, and that actually makes sure that most of the bids are friendly. We barely have 1 or 2 hostile takeover bids, I think.
So here's the context in which I think this has come up, right? So under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, as part of the resolution plan, is there going to be a resolution plan that involves a takeover?
Yeah,
right?
but they've been exempted from the takeover code, so...
Okay, got it. Yeah. All right. Okay, so that's still something to be figuring out as things go on. So thanks both Pradeep and Shubhata.